Imagine, for just a moment, being trapped in a time when your very body could be stolen from you, not your wealth, not your freedom alone, but the very essence of who you were. Throughout history, there have been punishments and rituals so cruel, so chilling, that they transcend ordinary horror and step into the realm of nightmare. Today, we are walking into the shadows of history's most horrifying castration methods, rituals of power, cruelty, and domination that few dared to speak of. But you will hear them now. What you are about to discover isn't just about pain, it's about control. It's about the way rulers, cults, and entire civilizations carved fear into flesh and bone. In the distant palaces of the Byzantine Empire, whispers filled the gilded halls of men who walked in silence, stripped not just of voice in politics, but of something far more personal. Eunuchs, once boys, once men, were remade against their will to serve at the pleasure of emperors. For some, it was seen as an honor; for others, an unspeakable fate. The procedure itself was shrouded in secrecy, often performed in hidden chambers by those who treated human life as malleable clay. Many never survived, their bodies giving in to fever or infection. But for those who did, the empire rewarded them with power, wealth, and a twisted form of respect. These men became both feared and pitied, standing as symbols of what ambition could cost in a world where loyalty was purchased with the body itself. Yet the Byzantines were far from alone in this dark practice. In imperial China, castration was both a punishment and a ticket to courtly influence. Entire dynasties leaned on eunuchs who wielded enormous power behind closed doors, often controlling the emperor's ear, and with it, the fate of the nation. But beneath that influence lay unthinkable suffering. The ritual was not just physical, it was psychological, designed to remind these men that their lives were never truly their own. Imagine knowing that your path to survival and status required surrendering everything that made you whole, and that the people you served valued your silence and obedience more than your humanity. The horror of these acts was not confined to great empires. In ancient tribes, there were rituals meant to test endurance, to appease gods, or to break the will of enemies. Some were carried out as punishments for betrayal, others as gruesome ceremonies intended to display dominance over conquered foes. In these settings, castration became more than mutilation. It became a language of terror, a signal to all who watched that power was absolute and mercy was non existent. The victims, whether criminals, prisoners of war, or the unlucky chosen, became unwilling sacrifices in a theater of cruelty. As you hear these stories, it may feel distant, old pages of history too dark to touch. But imagine, for one moment, the terror in the eyes of those who faced such a fate. Imagine the stillness in the chamber, the hush of onlookers, the knowledge that life would never again be the same. These men were stripped not just of flesh, but of dignity, identity, and legacy. Families shunned them. Children would never bear their names. And in the silence of their chambers, they must have wondered if they still belonged to the world of the living. It is easy, in modern times, to dismiss history as distant, but these horrors were real. They shaped politics, altered dynasties, and forged empires built upon suffering. They remind us of the dark ingenuity of human cruelty, how society can twist necessity into monstrosity, and how individuals can be remade into tools by force. And if you think what you've heard so far is shocking, know this: we've only begun to scrape the surface of the nightmare, because the methods you've heard were practiced behind gilded palace walls and within ancient temples. But in the next part of our journey, we descend deeper into rituals so unthinkable, so grotesque in their design, that even empires shuddered at their cruelty. The deeper you go into history's shadows, the more you realize that cruelty evolves with creativity. Where some civilizations institutionalized castration as punishment or service, others twisted it into spectacles of horror, ways to ensure that fear itself would outlive the victims. These weren't just acts of violence, they were messages carved into flesh, meant to echo through generations. One such tale emerges from the ancient Near East, where enemy captives were humiliated not just in body, but in spirit. Conquerors would sometimes mark their victories by stripping defeated soldiers of their masculinity, leaving them broken and incapable of reclaiming honor. This was not about survival, nor even about justice. It was psychological warfare at its most brutal, ensuring that the enemy would never rise again, neither in strength nor in bloodline. For the victims, death might have seemed a mercy compared to the lingering shame and isolation that followed. But perhaps the most chilling stories come from sects where castration was not imposed by rulers but chosen or coerced through religious fervor. In some cults, men gave themselves willingly, believing it brought them closer to the gods, shedding the physical as a sacrifice for spiritual purity. Yet beneath the chants and the rituals lay something more sinister. Was this devotion, or was it manipulation? Were these men reaching for the divine, or were they pawns in a game of power that cost them everything? The line between faith and fanaticism blurred, and in that blur, human suffering multiplied. It is at this point in the story where I must pause, not to break the spell, but to remind you, if these stories strike you, if you find yourself pulled into the forgotten horrors of history, this is the world we explore here together. The past holds no shortage of darkness, and if you want to continue this journey with me, I ask you to subscribe. Join me so that together we can bring to light the tales most would rather keep buried. Because buried they are. There are accounts so shocking they were almost erased. In medieval Europe, castration sometimes appeared in law codes as punishment for treason or grave offenses. Imagine the courtroom, the grim faces of judges who decreed such a fate, and the condemned who knew that his name, his lineage, his very place in society was about to vanish forever. In these moments, punishment was not just physical, it was erasure, a deletion of identity that stretched beyond one life and into generations. And as the centuries wore on, the methods only grew darker. Some devised techniques intended to maximize suffering, dragging out the process not for justice, but for spectacle. These were not punishments carried out in hidden chambers, but in public, where the act itself became theater, and the screams became warnings to all who watched. That, perhaps, is the cruelest horror of all. When human suffering becomes a performance, when agony is turned into a lesson etched into the minds of the crowd. What is left then when a man is broken in both body and soul? History shows us that some rose from their fate, carving influence and even power from their condition, but countless others vanished into obscurity, their stories untold, their names erased. It is only through the fragments of chronicles, the whispers of ancient records, that we piece together these accounts today. And in every fragment, we find the same truth, that power and cruelty often walk hand in hand, and that control over the body has always been one of history's most terrifying weapons. So, when we look back at these horrifying methods, it is not simply to recoil at the brutality of the past. It is to remember the victims whose suffering became footnotes in empire's rise and fall. It is to understand that the lengths to which humans will go to dominate one another are boundless. And it is to remind ourselves that though centuries pass, the shadows of cruelty linger, warning us of what humanity is capable of when power is left unchecked. The question I leave you with is this: if faced with such a fate, what would be worse, the pain of the act itself, or the life that followed in its aftermath? Share your thoughts below, because history's horrors mean nothing if we do not reflect on them together.